Chapter 1041. I'm going to fkook you. David's personal anger rose, and before Gu Kaiwan finished speaking, he punched Gu Kaiwan with a punch. Ning Ji, who was on the side, saw this. His aura suddenly soared, and this soaring aura was only a thin line away from the peak of the Great Master. David, cooperate with us well, you can still suffer less from flesh and blood. As Ning Ji said, he directly punched David. Boom! There was a violent explosion, and the surrounding trees were blown down by the air waves. David's figure retreated again and again, and Ning Ji was not much better, and he took 3 steps to stabilize his figure. No wonder you dare to provoke the martial arts alliance, your strength has increased a lot. Ning Ji looked at David and said. Stop talking nonsense, if Linger goes wrong, I will make you two disappear forever. After David finished speaking, he turned around and ran. He was going to see what happened to Gu Linger, he didn't want to fight with these two people. Master Ning, this guy is going to run. Seeing that David was about to run, Gu Kaiwan hurriedly shouted. Don't worry, he can't run away. Ning Ji seemed to have made up his mind a long time ago, and directly took out a silver silk screen from his arms. He didn't know what material the silk screen was made of. Tian Leda Wang. Ning Ji suddenly threw the wire mesh in his hand into the air, and soon the silvery wire mesh began to grow rapidly and shrouded David away. David was startled, and when his thoughts flashed, the dragon-slaying sword appeared in his hand, and the raging flames burned on the dragon-slaying sword. Cut! David slashed out with one sword, and the sharp blade slashed directly across the silk screen. There was a burst of fire, followed by the sound of metal collision, and the silk screen was not damaged at all under the dragon-slaying sword. Soon, David's body was wrapped in wire mesh, and it was getting closer and closer. No matter how hard David struggled, he couldn't break free. Ha ha ha, don't bother, this Tian Ledawang is a heaven-level magic weapon, even if Wu Hao is trapped, he can't break free. For you, I stole all the treasures of our Ning family. Ning Ji looked at David who was trapped, and said proudly. David's eyes were wide open and he glared at Ning Ji, but this Ning family actually has so many magic weapons, it can be seen that the strength is by no means ordinary. Gu Kaiwan, let's get started. Ning Ji said to Gu Kaiwan. Gu Kaiwan nodded, then holding the compass, a dagger slashed on David's finger, and a few drops of blood fell on the compass. Soon, the blood was absorbed by the compass, and then the compass began to shake violently, and bursts of red light flashed. Buzzing! The frequency of the compass shaking was getting bigger and bigger, making a humming sound, and finally it turned into a dragon roar. Rumbling! Suddenly, the earth began to tremble, and then the ground not far away rose up. Coming! Gu Kaiwan said with excitement in his eyes. Ning Ji's eyes also shone brightly, and a sword appeared in his hand. The two of them were waiting, but David, who was trapped at this time, felt that Long Jing in his body was constantly trembling, as if he had a feeling. Soon, the high bulge on the ground was getting closer and closer to them. Gu Kaiwan hurriedly threw the compass in his hand, and a golden light radiated from the compass, shining on the high bulge. Young Master Ning, do it! Gu Kaiwan hurriedly shouted. Ning Ji nodded, his body jumped up high, and the long sword in his hand stabbed into the high bulge. A burst of blood spurted out from the bulge. Ning Ji was overjoyed, just when he was about to draw his sword and stab again, suddenly the whole person seemed to be overturned by some kind of huge force, and he flew directly dozens of meters away. Chapter 1042. And from that high bulging place, a flame dragon that was burning with flames soared into the sky. Ning Ji's sword was still inserted into Yan Long's body. At the moment when the flame dragon appeared, the surrounding air seemed to be drained all at once, all the trees and flowers withered, and the temperature suddenly rose. Looking at this tens of meters long Yan Long, the faces of Ning Ji and Gu Kaiwan became a little ugly. David was also shocked. At that time, the ice dragon was just an ice dragon formed by someone casting an array on the dragon crystal. Speaking of which, the ice dragon is not a real dragon. But the flame dragon with wide open eyes and flames all over his body in front of him is a real dragon. From the breath emanating from this Yanlong, you can feel a deep sense of oppression. Ning! Young Master Ning, what should we do? Looking at the scary Yanlong in front of him, Gu Kaiwan was a little scared. Ning Ji also frowned. They really didn't expect that Yanlong would be so huge, and the aura emanating from his body could suppress them. How the fkook do I know what to do? Ning Ji cursed. They mistakenly thought that David killed the ice dragon at that time and took out the dragon crystal, which proved that the ice dragon and the flame dragon on Suolong Island were not very powerful. Now that the two of them have joined forces, their strength is much stronger than that of David at that time. In addition, there are magic weapons in their hands, and it is more than enough to deal with a flame dragon. But who knows, this Yanlong is actually such a colossus, and it is very powerful. The mid-air Zhong Yanlong trembled slightly, the sword stuck in his body fell, and then a coercion like a god descended over the heads of several people. For a moment, it was as if the heaven and the earth were one, and all the forces between the heaven and the earth were pressing on a few people. Puff, puff. Ning Ji and Gu Kaiwan didn't have the slightest resistance, so they fell to the ground and couldn't move. And David's body exudes golden light, gritted his teeth, resisting this coercion. But in the end, the golden light on David's body shattered, and his body fell to the ground on one knee. The dragon crystal in David's body is constantly shaking, and it emits bursts of light waves, which seems to be attracting the idea of Yanlong. Sure enough, Yanlong's copper bell-like eyes looked at David, and then he opened his bloody mouth and walked towards David. David saw Yanlong rushing towards him, his eyes were full of horror, he hurriedly struggled desperately, but it was useless at all, the net was too strong, David couldn't break free. Seeing that David was about to be swallowed, at this moment, the Taipei ring on David's hand suddenly flickered. But just as the Taipei ring flickered, the flame dragon suddenly stopped and looked at David in front of him quietly. The flame dragon's eyes were full of fear and awe. Buzzing! The ice dragon Longjing in David's body began to tremble violently, and David's body trembled along with it. Yanlong also felt the trembling of the ice dragon Longjing. After hesitating for a while, he opened his mouth again. When David thought that Yanlong was going to swallow him in one bite, suddenly a flaming bead flew out of Yanlong's mouth. This scene directly made David look stupid. Could this be Yanlong's dragon crystal? David thought to himself. But the flaming bead flew to David's mouth. David himself didn't know what to think, but he opened his mouth and swallowed the bead. What? Just after swallowing it, David felt like his body was being roasted in a mountain of flames, and his whole body was about to explode. Chapter 1043. Soon, David's body also began to burst into flames, becoming like a burning man. But soon, a layer of light mist instantly extinguished the flames on David's body, and then the ice dragon crystal in David's body began to emit a lot of cold air, which was neutralized by the flames on David's body. The two dragon crystals circled together, and finally collided, a terrifying force surrounded David, forming a storm. I don't know how long it took, the two dragon crystals were completely fused together, David's body seemed to be in an ice cave for a while, and then it was like a mountain of flames. To the extreme, to resist this double torture. Soon, the force that tortured David's body began to slowly converge and condense, and finally all sank into his dantian. At this moment, there seemed to be flames burning in David's eyes. Under the concentration, a scorching light blazed out, and even blasted a deep pit on the ground. This. David was a little stunned. He felt that the power in his body was much more tyrannical than the spiritual power he usually cultivated. And this power gave David an inexplicable sense of familiarity, as if this power originally belonged to him. Slowly suppressing this force, David's eyes returned to normal. Feeling the change in David's body, Yanlong suddenly let out a dragon roar, and then his body rose into the air and plunged into the sea. Yanlong left, the terrifying pressure disappeared instantly. Ningxi and Gu Kaiwan stood up, and David also stood up slowly. Ningxi and Gu Kaiwan saw the scene just now. They couldn't understand why they wanted to swallow David's Yanlong at a critical moment, why they stopped at a critical moment and gave David their own dragon crystal. Although they don't understand it, they know that David at this moment must already have the power of the dragon. Gu Kaiwan, kill him quickly and take out Long Jing. Ningxi said loudly to Gu Kaiwan. Gu Kaiwan's face flashed a hint of ruthlessness, clenched his fists, and smashed at David. David is now bound and has no power to fight back, so Gu Kaiwan is unguarded. But at this moment, the golden light on David's body, the heaven and earth net that bound David, were all torn apart and scattered. I just took the practice hands. David looked at Gu Kaiwan coldly, and then his fist wrapped in golden light also waved out. Boom! The two punched together, and then the golden light burst, and Gu Kaiwan's body flew out like a kite with a broken string. However, David did not stop, his body jumped up, and the golden fist with the power of destroying and pulling the rotten, slammed towards Gu Kaiwan again. Gu Kaiwan's face was shocked, he hurriedly recited the mantra, and saw a golden light protecting Gu Kaiwan's chest. Clang! David smashed it out with a punch, and it was as if he smashed directly on the steel. When I looked closely, I found the compass in Gu Kaiwan's hand, which was emitting light at this time, protecting it in front of Gu Kaiwan's chest. Just now, David hit the compass with a punch. Although this punch did not break the compass, it is obvious that there are cracks on the compass. My opening plate. Looking at the cracked compass, Gu Kaiwan was so distressed that he almost didn't cry. Looking at this scene, Ningxi frowned, and the corners of his eyes kept twitching. Don't fucking howl, this kid has the power of a dragon now, we're going to join forces to kill him. Ningxi knew that relying on his own strength alone, he was afraid that he would not be David's opponent. The power of the dragon. David was slightly taken aback when he heard the word. Chapter 1044. Could it be that the mysterious power in his body is the power of the dragon? And this power comes from the fusion of two dragon crystals. David looked at Ningxi and Gu Kaiwan. He finally knew it. It turned out that these two guys had already known the secret. They knew that the combination of Ice Dragon Dragon Crystal and Yanlong Dragon Crystal would give birth to the power of Shenlong. There is nothing special about swallowing a single Dragon Crystal, that is, there is some spiritual energy in the Dragon Crystal. But who would have thought that swallowing two Dragon Crystals would produce different effects? Hearing Ningxi's roar, Gu Kaiwan put away his sadness, his eyes flashed with killing intent, and then he shouted loudly. I saw that the already cracked compass began to shine again at this moment, and Gu Kaiwan was enveloped in the light. Soon, Gu Kaiwan's thin body began to skyrocket, and every inch of his muscles was wrapped in light. Like a giant of light. The compass hovered above Gu Kaiwan's head, and one person and one tool seemed to be integrated together. David, if you destroy my magic weapon, I will kill you. Gu Kaiwan burst into roars, and the whole person was like a beast. Ningxi also waved his hand and took the sword on the ground, his whole body was full of murderous aura. We killed him together, the treasures on him are ours. After Ningxi finished speaking, he swung his sword towards David. The terrifying sword energy swept through a wave of air, as if torn apart the entire space. Gu Kaiwan also started at the same time, and suddenly he punched out, like a laser, directly towards David. The speed was extremely fast. Facing the simultaneous attack of two people, David frowned and his face became very solemn. After weighing the pros and cons, David raised the dragon-slaying sword in his hand and swung a sword directly to meet Ningxi's terrifying sword energy. Boom! There was a loud noise, and the two swords collided, making a deafening sound. However, Gu Kaiwan's punch was already in front of him. David wanted to dodge, but it was too late. He could only exert his undamaged golden body to the extreme. The scales flashing on his body began to grow rapidly, forming on David's body an airtight golden armor. Dong dong dong. With 3 dull sounds, David only felt that his internal organs were rolling. It turned out that Gu Kaiwan seemed to punch with 1 punch, but he directly punched 3 punches. All 3 punches hit David's chest. Although most of the power was resisted by David's fleshly body, there was still an extremely powerful force that penetrated David's indestructible golden body. This power directly made the Danshan in David's body tremble, and the spiritual power in the body was also messed up, and it couldn't be condensed together for a while. Seeing the timing when David's spiritual power was chaotic, then Gu Kaiwan threw a punch again, smashing David's body hard, and directly smashing David's body out. After knocking down more than a dozen trees in a row, David's body stopped, and blood spilled from the corner of his mouth. David adjusted his breathing on the screen, trying his best to calm down the spiritual power in his body. As far as your strength is concerned, you should hand over the dragon crystal on your body obediently, so as not to suffer from flesh and blood again. Gu Kaiwan sneered. Ning Ji saw that David couldn't even handle Gu Kaiwan, and the nervousness just now relaxed. It seems that the dragon crystal has just merged, and David has not fully grasped the power of the dragon. David did not speak, he was using this short time to regulate the spiritual power in his body. However, Gu Kaiwan's strength is not high, but he has rich combat experience and is blessed with magical weapons, so it is very difficult to deal with. Next to him was Ning Ji, who was staring at him. Facing the 2 of them, David didn't have a plan against the enemy for a while. Chapter 1045. Stop talking nonsense with him, kill him first. Ning Ji knew that Ye Chongmeng had many dreams, so he held a sword and attacked David again. But this time, David did not follow Ning Ji to fight hard, but dodged the sharp sword with a flash. David's body just dodged Ning Ji's sword attack, and then Gu Kaiwan's tyrannical energy hit. Gu Kaiwan calculated the timing for David to dodge, and then found that David had just dodged the attack, but before he could stand firm, he launched a sudden attack, making David unable to guard against it. Sure enough, this time Gu Kaiwan succeeded again and smashed David out more than 10 meters away. David is now facing the enemy, his face has become extremely dignified. David didn't adjust his breath this time, but slightly flipped the dragon-slaying sword in his hand, and then his body shook for a while, and soon another David appeared. Then 3, 4, 5. 5 identical David, standing opposite Ning Ji and Gu Kaiwan, all have the same breath on their bodies. It is impossible to tell which is David's body by relying on breath. Facing 5 identical David, Gu Kaiwan was suddenly a little dumbfounded, but Ning Ji smiled coldly. I didn't expect you to learn the 9 shadows of Ichiro Watanabe, but these illusions will bluff other people. Well, in front of me, it's not worth mentioning. Really? Then try it. After David finished speaking, the first sword of the 9 shadows sword art went straight towards Ning Ji. 5 terrifying sword chi made the surrounding world change color. Ning Ji smiled coldly, his eyes narrowed slightly, and the sword in his hand made a humming sound. He knew that among these 5 sword chi, only one was powerful, and the others were not worth mentioning. As long as he finds the most powerful sword energy among them, he can block it with one sword. It's a pity that the 5 swords chi flew towards Ning Ji, and when he was in front of Ning Ji's face became extremely ugly. Because he found that these 5 sword chi actually contained great killing intent, and each one seemed to be able to crush him. The helpless Ning Ji could only block the sword in front of him, and a faint white light appeared in front of Ning Ji, forming a shield. Clang! With a loud bang, the entire Suolong Island seemed to be shaking, and Ning Ji's body flew straight out, hitting the ground heavily. This sudden change surprised Gu Kaiwan. Young Master Ning! Gu Kaiwan hurried over and helped Ning Ji up. Ning Ji wiped the blood from the corners of his mouth, and said with a grim look, "Damn, this kid's avatar also contains strength, which is much stronger than that of Ichiro Watanabe, let's go together. The sword in Ning Zhi's hand shone with light, and then a huge light group seemed to rise above the tip of the sword, and a terrifying aura enveloped Ning Zhi's whole body. When Gu Kaiwen saw this, he also clenched his fists. With the blessing of the compass, Gu Kaiwen's fists also turned into two balls of light. Thump! A few balls of light headed directly towards David. David gritted his teeth, slashed the dragon-slaying sword in his hand fiercely, and the five-sword chi waved out again, resisting the attack of Ning Zhi and Gu Kaiwen. In an instant, several breaths collided together, and a violent explosion sounded. The agitated dust covered the sky, like an aerial bomb exploded. Puff! David spewed out a mouthful of blood, and his body fell heavily on the ground, and several shadow clones disappeared in an instant. Although David has a shadow clone, and the shadow clone also has strength, the spiritual power consumed by the shadow clone also comes from David's Danshin. In this case, the spiritual power in David's Danshin is directly consumed 5 times, and it can't support it at all. At this moment, David's chest was sunken, his ribs were obviously broken, and the spiritual power in his Danshin was almost exhausted. Chapter 1046. The smoke cleared. Looking at David, who was full of embarrassment, Ning Zhi raised his mouth slightly. Now all the treasures on you will be mine. Ning Zhi slowly walked towards David, followed by Gu Kaiwen. The two looked proud and relaxed. David was already like this, and there was no threat. David frowned, desperately trying to condense the spiritual power in his body, but the spiritual power in his body collapsed, and it was almost exhausted, and now he has no strength to stand up. What about the power of the dragon? David looked at Ning Zhi and Gu Kaiwen, who came over, and he was so anxious. He can't feel the domineering power from the beginning now. The fused dragon crystal is suspended in the body like this, and there is no trace of power. What's the matter? David felt it with his heart and wanted to rush to find that power, but unfortunately, no matter how anxious he was, he still couldn't sense it, as if the power was no longer in his body. At this moment, Ning Zhi and Gu Kaiwen had already walked to David, and then looked down at David. Their faces were full of pride. Gu Kaiwen stepped forward and stepped on David's chest, the corner of his mouth raised, and said, "You kid ruined my magic weapon. I think your sword is good, then use this sword to deal with it." Gu Kaiwen said, bent over to pick up David's dragon-slaying sword. In fact, what Gu Kaiwen said was meant to be heard by Ning Zhi. He was afraid that after killing David, all the treasures on David's body would become Ning Zhi's. After all, in addition to Long Jing, David's dragon-slaying sword is also a rare weapon. Just when Gu Kaiwen bent over to pick up David's dragon-slaying sword, the dragon-slaying sword suddenly buzzed, followed by a sharp sword chi, which directly cut Gu Kaiwen's palm. Fortunately, Gu Kaiwen dodged quickly, otherwise the sword would have been cut at his throat. Gu Kaiwen's palm was bloody, and he looked at David and the dragon-slaying sword in shock. At this moment, David no longer has the strength to fight back, but this dragon-slaying sword can have self-consciousness and do it to himself, which is simply too amazing. His sword has long been integrated with his body. The sword is born from the heart. If you want to get this sword, you must kill him. Ning Zhi looked at Gu Kaiwen like a fool and said. Gu Kaiwen realized this, so he raised his foot and stepped on David fiercely. If this foot is hit, with David's current appearance, I am afraid that one foot will crush his entire body. But at this moment, the Taipei ring in David's hand flickered slightly again, and then the dragon crystal in his body burst out with an incomparably overbearing power. This power spreads out in David's body instantly, like a big net, wrapping David by himself. Gu Kaiwen's foot hadn't stepped on David, but was directly thrown away by a huge rebound. David stood up slowly, a trace of scarlet flashing in his eyes. At this time, the aura on David's body was exactly the same as when the Yanlong appeared just now. Ning Zhi frowned, and his figure quickly retreated. He was not a fool. The breath on David's body at this moment was obviously the power of the dragon. Just kill him! Ningxi shouted. Gu Kaiwan, who was ejected, jumped up at the moment, and then the compass above his head radiated light, and then this light directly shrouded David. David didn't pay attention to it, but felt the power of the dragon, and was very excited. At this moment, under the blessing of the power of the dragon, David's indestructible golden body became stronger, and the golden light flickered even more dazzlingly. Gu Kaiwan followed the light of the compass and rushed directly to David. The huge power cooperated with the light of the compass, directly triggering the power of heaven and earth, and the whole sky began to roll up a gust of wind. Chapter 1047. David looked at Gu Kaiwan, his eyes were as calm as water. At this moment, he looked at Gu Kaiwan as if he was looking at the clown jumping on the beam. The power of the dragon on his body gave David absolute confidence. Just when Gu Kaiwan arrived in front of David, suddenly, the dragon-slaying sword in David's hand shone brightly, the fire soared into the sky, and then a sword slashed towards the compass above Gu Kaiwan's head. David knew that without the blessing of this magic weapon, Gu Kaiwan's strength would drop instantly, which is not a cause for concern. Click! This sword directly cut Gu Kaiwan's compass in half, the light on the compass disappeared, and all the mana disappeared. Gu Kaiwan screamed, his body fell heavily, and then his body quickly shrank to a thin appearance, and the breath on his body also dropped a lot. My magic weapon! Looking at the completely destroyed compass, Gu Kaiwan was heartbroken. Gu Kaiwan stared at David, trembling slightly, his eyes full of murderous intent. I fought for you. Gu Kaiwan condensed his energy and planned to follow David to the last fight. The terrifying power began to spread on Gu Kaiwan, followed by an angry shout, and slammed into David. Come back soon. Seeing this, Ningxi hurriedly asked Gu Kaiwan to return. Without the persistence of the magic weapon, Gu Kaiwan could not be David's opponent at all, especially now that David was blessed with the power of the dragon. But at this moment, Gu Kaiwan is like crazy, how can he listen to Ningxi's words? Facing the crazy Gu Kaiwan, David slowly greeted him with a punch. This simple punch contained an incomparably terrifying and domineering power. Boom! Gu Kaiwan followed David with a punch, and regretted it instantly, because he felt an incomparably overbearing energy that had penetrated his arm and entered his internal organs directly. This force directly made Gu Kaiwan fly upside down like a kite with a broken string, and his body slammed into the ground, smashing the ground into a big hole. When Gu Kaiwan climbed out of the deep pit, he was already in a state of embarrassment, his arms were strangely bent, his body was covered in mud, and there was blood flowing out of his mouth and nose. When he looked at David again, Gu Kaiwan had panic in his eyes. My dragon-slaying sword is here. Do you still want it? The dragon-slaying sword in David's hand was raised high, and a terrifying atmosphere enveloped the area for thousands of meters. Pfft! Gu Kaiwan was crushed to the ground under this terrifying aura, like a dead dog. Me! Gu Kaiwan didn't know how to answer David. Now, how could he dare to attack David's idea of slaying the dragon sword? Ningxi on the side, his eyes flickered. He didn't know what he was thinking. Do you still want the dragon crystal in my body? David asked Ningxi with a playful face. Ningxi's face was pale, and the breath on his body rose. David, even if you have the power of a dragon, you don't need to be so mad. Today, the dragon crystal on your body, I will decide. Ningxi gritted his teeth, and then took out the Qunkan circle. When the Qunkan circle appeared, a quaint atmosphere began to envelope Ningxi. Do you think my Qunkan circle is just an escape tool? Ningxi smiled coldly, and then threw the Qunkan circle towards David. The Qunkan circle suddenly soared, and then several breaths shot out from the Qunkan circle. When David saw this, the dragon-slaying sword in his hand instantly waved an airtight barrier in front of him. Clang clang clang! A series of sounds. Several breaths hit the barrier in front of David, and they were all blocked. Ningxi frowned, once again urging the Kyunkan circle to suspend above David's head, and then a coercion in the Kyunkan circle directly shrouded down. Chapter 1048. David suddenly felt a huge pressure attacking him, as if the whole mountain was pressing on him. David gritted his teeth, and then the scarlet in his eyes became thicker, and the manic and domineering power in his body exploded directly. The huge power made that coercion disappear instantly, and the circle of heaven and earth suspended above David's head was also jumped up and returned to Ningxi's hands. Feeling the power of the overbearing dragon, David was overjoyed. "What else do you have? Just use it." David looked at Ningxi coldly. "David, don't be complacent, you will be beautiful sooner or later." After Ningxi finished speaking, he threw it in the air, and a dark entrance appeared in the Kyunkan circle. Ningxi grabbed Gu Kaiwan and jumped into the entrance instantly. When David wanted to catch up, he found that the entrance had disappeared. David hurriedly looked around, because Ningxi told him that the distance of this universe circle was only 100 meters, so David only had to look and see where the two people fled this year. It's just that David watched for a long time, but he didn't find the figures of Ningxi and Gu Kaiwan. With David's current vision, he could see it clearly even if it was 1000 meters, let alone 1000 meters. But there were no two figures at all at this time. The only explanation was that the distance of the Kyunkan circle was not 100 meters, but that Ningxi lied to David. What a fucking villain! When he thought that he was deceived by Ningxi, David couldn't help but scolded him. Putting away the dragon-slaying sword, David hurriedly ran towards the shore. He was worried about Gulinger's safety. He wanted to know if Gulinger was really poisoned by Gu Kaiwan. At this time, at the dock where Suolong Island was docked, Gu Wenchen and the others were anxiously revolving around Gulinger. No one knew what happened to Gulinger. Not long after she landed on the island, Gulinger collapsed to the ground, her body was still twitching regularly. This frightened Gu Wenchen and the others, and hurriedly carried Gulinger back to the pier. Because a few people don't know what to do, and now that David is not here, they are all anxious like ants on a hot pot. "Linger, Linger, wake up, wake up!" Gu Wenchen held Gulinger's hand tightly, and burst into tears. "Ancient, don't worry. Although Linger is in a coma, her breath is still stable. There should be no major problems. Wait for David to come and let David take a look." Reuben persuaded Gu Wenchen, then looked at Lin Tianhu and said, "Lin Tianhu, go find David and get David back as soon as possible." "Okay." Lin Tianhu nodded and hurriedly went to find David. And at this moment, David is also desperately rushing towards the pier. Lin Tianhu didn't go far when he met David. "Mr. Chen." Seeing David, Lin Tianhu immediately shouted happily. "Lin Tianhu, why are you here? What about Linger and the others?" Seeing Lin Tianhu, David had a bad feeling in his heart. "Mr. Chen, I'm here to find you. I don't know why, Miss Linger suddenly fell into a coma, and now Gu is in a panic," Lin Tianhu said to David. When David heard this, his brows furrowed tightly, and his body flashed towards the pier. Lin Tianhu followed closely behind. When the two arrived at the pier, they found Gulinger lying on a piece of grass, motionless, and Gu Wenchen was standing beside him with tears in his eyes. Seeing David coming, Gu Wenchen hurriedly got up, grabbed David and said, "David, you must save Linger, she doesn't know what happened," and suddenly fainted. "Ancient, don't worry, I already know what's going on." David squatted down and helped Gulinger up. A piece of spiritual power was input into Gulinger's body, but it was useless at all, and then David probed Gulinger's breath, and he finally breathed a sigh of relief. Chapter 1049. Although Gulinger's breath is weak, but not fatal, but to wake Gulinger, David has no way to do it. Now she doesn't know what kind of poison Gulinger is in. Just now, David tried to suck out the poison from Gulinger's body with the concentration technique, but it was useless. "David, how is Linger?" Gu Wenchen asked worriedly. Linger will not be in danger, David comforted Gu Wenchen, then looked at Lin Tianhu and said, Lin Tianhu, find a boat, we have to go back immediately, it doesn't matter how much it costs. Because many ships have just arrived, there is no return journey. If you want to return, it is estimated that it will cost a lot of money. Just when Lin Tianhu was about to look for the return ship, Jin Fuxian walked over with a smile. Ancient, encountered difficulties? Jin Fuxian asked. My granddaughter is ill, so I need to return immediately. I don't know if Boss Jin has a boat for the return journey. The price is negotiable. Gu Wenchen said to Jin Fuxian. Because Gu Wenchen bought so many antiques at the auction, Jin Fuxian knew Gu Wenchen. Jin Fuxian glanced at Gu Linger, then nodded and said, I'll let the cruise ship return right away. This ship is big, so go faster, don't delay seeing your eldest niece. Jin Fuxian was very enthusiastic and generous. He even let the cruise ship return and sent David and the others back. When Gu Wenchen heard this, he immediately said with gratitude, Boss Jin, thank you so much. It's all trivial, you guys get on the boat, I'll let them go right away. Jin Fuxian asked Gu Wenchen and the others to board the boat, while he went to tell the captain's room and set sail directly. The luxurious cruise ship returned, and David looked at Gu Linger, who was in a coma, with a very solemn expression. With his medical skills, coupled with the supreme pills passed down by the master of medicine God Valley, what kind of incurable disease is not good to look at? But David couldn't find out what kind of poison was in Gu Linger's body. 2 days after the return flight, several people were in a low mood. And at this moment in a luxurious private room in the cabin, Jin Fuxian is holding a beautiful woman in his arms, holding a glass of red wine. How comfortable! At this moment, a middle-aged man in a suit walked in. Is it all arranged? Jin Fuxian asked the middle-aged man. Boss, everything has been arranged. They have already boarded the ship and set off. They will meet with us in 2 hours. The man in the suit said respectfully. Very good, find more good players. Among these guys, there may be some good players. As long as you kill them and throw the corpses into the sea, we won't have to send out the antiques that are auctioned off. Jin Fuxian's mouth is the same, his eyes are full of greed. It turned out that this guy didn't want Gu Wenchen to take those antiques away, so he had bad intentions and planned to kill Gu Wenchen and the others on the boat, and then throw the corpses into the sea, so that they would not know it. Don't worry, boss, I directly invited the 4 heroes of Nanshan. All 4 of them are Wuzong, and one of them has reached the peak of Wuzong and will soon step into the ranks of the great Wuzong. The man in the suit said confidently. Well, yes, when they arrive, bring them directly to me. Jin Fuxian nodded with satisfaction. Yes. The man in the suit backed out. And that Jin Fuxian drank the red wine in the glass in one go. Lin Tianhu, how long does it take to dock? David has been guarding Gu Linger in the room, checking Gu Linger's breath from time to time. Although Gu Linger's vital signs are stable now, David is still anxious. He wants to dock as soon as possible, and then send Gu Linger away. Medicine God Valley. Maybe Elder Su and the others will have a solution. After all, they have been practicing medicine for many years, and they have seen more diseases and poisons than themselves. Chapter 1050. Mr. Chen, it's almost docked after dawn. You haven't slept well these days, why don't you sleep for a while? Lin Tianhu said with concern. For the past 2 days, David has hardly slept at all and has been staying by Gu Linger's side. He was afraid that he would fall asleep. What happened to Gu Linger during this period? I'm fine, go to sleep, and protect Uncle Su and Gu Gu. I always feel that this Boss Jin is weird. David warned Lin Tianhu. They followed Jin Fuxian, not even relatives, not even friends. They just bought most of the collection at the auction. If Jin Fuxian wanted to help them, he would curry favor with Gu Wenchen and just send a small boat. One must know that the cost of a return trip on this luxury cruise ship is astronomical. And this time is 4 days, and those tourists on the island will definitely be in trouble. Those who can board this luxury cruise ship are not ordinary people. Now that Jin Fuxian would rather risk offending all the tourists and send them back with such luxury and force, there must be something tricky about it. Businessmen seek profit, but David does not believe that Jin Fuxian is kind. Well, I will pay attention. Lin Tianhu nodded. More than 2 hours later, it was almost dawn, and it was not far from the Nanhua city wharf. At this moment, several speedboats quietly approached the cruise ship, and then 7 or 8 people went up the suspended ladder to the cruise ship. Soon, these people were taken to Jin Fuxian's room. Among these people, there were 4 people who looked exactly the same. These were the 4 heroes of Nanshan, and the 4 were quadruplets. "Boss, people are here." A man in a suit walked into Jin Fuxian's room and said. Jin Fuxian sorted out his clothes, waved his hands and said, "Let them come in." Soon, a few people from Nanshan 4 heroes walked in. Seeing this, Jin Fuxian hurriedly got up to meet him. Although these 4 heroes of Nanshan are not very old, they are very powerful. Many times, Jin Fuxian's activities of killing people and stealing goods are completed by these 4 people. 4, please. Jin Fuxian very politely invited the 4 heroes of Nanshan to his seat. "Boss Jin, is there any good deal for the 4 of us to come here?" asked the eldest of the Nanshan 4 heroes. "Of course, otherwise, why would you wake up in the middle of the night?" Jin Fuxian smiled faintly. "Tell me, what is the price this time, and who is dealing with it? The 4 of us have to figure it out," the boss asked bluntly. Jin Fuxian looked around. The man in the suit hurriedly kicked everyone else out of the room. "To tell the 4 of you, there are a few people on my boat right now, all of them tourists from Horindal. I plan to invite the 4 of you to kill them. As for the reward, you can do whatever you want," Jin Fuxian said directly. "How many tourists?" The boss was slightly taken aback. "If it's just a few tourists, Boss Jin's subordinates can handle it casually, and you won't let the 4 of us come to earn money, right?" They know Jin Fuxian too well. They can die for money. If the other party is easy to deal with, Jin Fuxian will not be able to give up the money and invite them here. There are 2 warriors among these people, and they feel that their strength is not low, so I invited you guys just in case," Jin Fuxian explained. "Oh, so that's what happened. Since the other party has 2 warriors, we don't know how strong we are, so it's not easy to discuss the price in detail, but the minimum cannot be less than 10 million. No problem, as long as you kill these few people and throw them all into the sea, I'll give you 50 million. Before the boss could finish speaking, Jin Fuxian agreed. Tens of millions are nothing to tens of billions of antiques.